Today, we will look at some options when choosing foundations in Christian ethics. Every attempt at making an ethical decision assumes some kind of foundation. This foundation is the root framework for deciding what makes action or character good or bad. Foundation serves as the primary factor in determining what it means to choose the good and usually carries a glimpse of how that good will be attained in the rough and tumble of real life. In choosing a foundation for Christian ethics, we have 4 options, namely, number 1, consequences ethics or teleological ethics. Number 2, principle ethics or deontologism, or they call it deontological ethics. Number 3, character or virtue ethics. And lastly, a Christian worldview, foundation for Christian ethics. Let us examine the first one, consequences or consequential ethics. It is once again called teleological ethics because it holds that the basic standard of morality is precisely the value of what an action brings into human being. It is also a belief that what makes an action right or wrong is the results. Consequentialists therefore believe that the ultimate criteria or standard of right and wrong is based on ends or the result. For example, committing adultery is not inherently wrong in and of itself, but through our life together as human beings, the consequences that arise from adultery may render it morally suspect. Another example is telling the truth. According to consequentialists, one tells the truth as a consequentialist not because truth-telling is in itself a moral obligation, but because in most situations, telling truth produces the best result. Now, what happens when consequences become the foundation of ethics? There would be many problems. For example, one challenge is which consequences? Another challenge is what type of results? Now, generally, consequentialists have contended or argued that the results calculated are not moral principles or virtues, but non-moral results. Since all human beings by nature seem to pursue happiness or pleasure in life, and according to them, happiness is the prime candidate for the non-moral consequences utilized in the evaluation process. Because of that, there are 2 kinds of ethics that were born in this kind of argument. Number 1, the ethical egoism. According to this, one ought to do whatever will produce one's own highest good, determined by the amount of pleasure or happiness that the person will receive from that kind of action. However, we have to understand that ethical egoism is far more than selfish impulses. It has been set forth as a moderate, rational ethic intended to be the best possible way to achieve the good. One best example is the philosopher Epicurus. He was born in 341 to 270 BC. According to him, life is something to be enjoyed. How? Well, by indulging in moderate pleasures. Personal pleasure is the highest good and the main goal of life, but, according to him, it is never to be an unbridled pleasure. There are guardrails. For Epicurus, hedonism, or they call it the pleasure principle must always be pursued through self-restraint, moderation, and detachment. Now, I would like us to assess the ethical egoism from a Christian standpoint. First, ethical egoism faces a number of problems. For one, it runs contrary to agape love, which from both biblical teaching and the example of Jesus is a self-giving and self-sacrificing love. In the biblical framework, authentic selfhood is not found in seeking one's own interest, but actually in being other-oriented. As the Lord says, love your neighbor, love others, of course, without negating one's own self. We have learned from the Bible that from the beginning, we learn that humans can best fulfill what God intended through a dependence, not on their own selves, but on their Maker, on their Creator. Dependence on God, not on one's own highest good. Aside from ethical egoism, the second one is utilitarianism. Utilitarianism, like ethical egoists, they believe that the moral good is rooted or founded in, of course, consequences. However, they look to a different set of consequences, like those that relate to, remember this, the greatest number of people. For example, in the case of capital punishment. Now, if executing a criminal resulted in the greatest amount of pleasure for the greatest number of people, then capital punishment is morally good. Conversely, if capital punishment resulted in pain for the greatest number of people, then it was a moral evil. So remember, utilitarianism teaches us to determine morals on the basis of maximizing pleasure and minimizing pain. Now, I would like us to assess that also from the Christian's perspective. But first of all, we have to understand that they have to be respected also for their attempts to show that ethics ought to make a significant difference in outcomes and specifically in the way people are affected. For example, the early utilitarians also contributed to understanding of justice, which treated all people from the standpoint of fairness and impartiality. Now, the problem comes in when utilitarianism is set as a foundation for ethics. Utilitarianism faces some significant problems, practically, rationally, and of course, biblically. And so let's take a look at the first one. Practically, there are practical problems because utilitarianism assumes that we can objectively weigh the consequences of a given course of action. But this is highly debatable. Why? Because often our biggest differences in ethics are over the empirical or factual judgments surrounding an issue. For this to work, one would have to be able to accomplish the following. For example, you have to identify all possible courses of action. Then after that, for each course of action, you have to identify all people affected. And then for each person, you have to identify every pain or pleasure likely to result from the action. And then assign each of these pains and pleasures a numerical value. Calculate the net gain look at the loss for each person. You sum up these gains and losses to get a grand total for each course of action. And then you carry out the course of action. Very, very impractical. So there's a practical problem. In fact, practical problems. The second one is the rational problem. When utilitarians set forth pleasure or happiness as the consequential criterion, the problem is they're actually establishing an intrinsic moral ideal. For it is not at all evident how pleasure and happiness can be an unmoral base of judgment. I don't understand. To put it another way, utilitarianism is always forced to designate a basis for judging consequences, and in doing so, they are actually becoming a kind of principle ethics, which we will be discussed later on. Now, from a Christian perspective, it is easily leads to an end justifies the means ideal, and some means leading toward a good end may not be actually morally justified. This seems to be inevitable in utilitarianism because no criteria other than consequences can limit an action. The issue of the end justifying the means gets played out today in a host of issues. For example, take a look at the issue of war. Take a look at the issue of poverty or human rights and abortion, euthanasia, and the use of embryonic tissue for stem cell research. For Christians, it ought to raise the moral red flag. Another problem is that in the area of utilitarianism, it does not recognize that some things in and of themselves are actually good or bad, worthy of pursuit or of rejection. In the utilitarian schema, something is valued only to the degree that it produces good consequences for the greatest number of people. But when you look at the Christian worldview, there are givens that are good, right, and true, regardless of their outcome in a particular time and place. Now, take a look at this example. I would like you to read this example. It says there at the end, it seems highly probable that moral evil is absolutely necessary to the production of moral excellence. According to the Christian worldview, there are givens that are good, right, and true. For example, the sanctity of human life, honesty, justice, love, the sanctity and permanence of marriage, and compassion. They are not goods to pursue because they are make human happier or bring more pleasure, though of course in the long run they will usually do so. This and a host of other virtues are to be pursued because they are worthy pursuits in and of themselves, and because they are ultimately rooted in the nature and actions of God and the worldview that flows from that transcendent reality. To put it together, Christians, we do not agree or embrace the consequential ethics like the egoism and, of course, the utilitarianism, because we believe that there is a transcendent point of reference by which our decision must be founded. This foundation is God Himself, ultimately rooted in the nature, in the actions of our God.